have Donald W. Sharp. He's with us here on Tuesday, May 13th, 2003. Mr. Sharp was born in Franklin, Kentucky on December 11th, 1946. He's currently living in Mainsville, Ohio. He has served for the United States Marine Corps. His highest rank was an E7. His dates of enlistment and service were from 1966 to 1978, where he served in the Vietnam War. One of his special awards was the Navy Accommodation Medal with Combat 5. I'd like to introduce and to have a pleasure to talk to this morning Mr. Donald Sharp.
First question. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I enlisted.
Where were you living at the time when you enlisted?
Jeffersonville, Indiana. I was attending Indiana University and decided to drop out of school to enlist.
Why did you pick the service branch that you enlisted in?
I guess I was always enamored by the Marine Corps, and felt like it was very challenging, so that's why I decided.
What year was it that you entered into the Marine Corps?
1966, April 28th. I remember it well.
What did you first feel like when you enlisted?
I think because of the time that was going on, I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I was in school, and just felt like I was kind of wasting time away. And this was right after Vietnam had started to really pick up, and the draft was on. And if you didn't make your grades, you got drafted. So I fooled and I enlisted rather than getting drafted. So I don't know really why. I think it was just I was caught up in the time. I had a lot of friends who were involved in the war at that time, and it just felt like the thing to do. So,
Can you tell us a little bit about your boot camp experiences?
you won't believe this, but when I was 19 and went to boot camp, they cut all my hair off. It was the first time I was really away from home so far. I went to Parris Island, South Carolina, and it was obviously a different type of environment. I had never been around that much heat and that much swamps before in my life, so it was kind of different. And I think the big thing was that everybody there was the same, and we were all quite young. I think I was the oldest person in my platoon. I was 19, so it was a very young group. Like I said, it was a different time, and at the time, it was really the start of the gear up for Vietnam. So the training methods that we were using were not. I was in the first group of Marine recruits that were trained by men who had been in Vietnam. Prior to that, the training was a lot different than it was when we started through.
What was your view on the war in Vietnam before you entered?
Didn't really have a view. I think we're all product of our experiences. My dad was a World War II veteran. My grandfather was a World War I veteran. My great-great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. My great-great-great-grandfather was in the Revolutionary War. I was the fifth generation of my family to be involved in a conflict at the time. I don't know how I felt politically about the war. It was obviously a very, you're either for it or you're against it. I'm not saying I was for war just because I went to the Marine Corps, but I knew I was going to end up there because we all did. But I didn't really think about it as something I believed in as far as war or not war. I think you got to be an idiot to believe in war. So I think it was a combination of political, my background, the way I was raised by my family, that you should go out and serve your country. And it was a time that we were in conflict, and it felt like the thing to do.
What year were you shipped out for the war?
1968. January 2nd.
Can you tell us exactly where you went to?
I landed in Da Nang, Vietnam, which is up in the upper portion towards the north side. I spent most of my time when I was in country no more than 15 miles south of the DMZ. So when you if you talk to other people who are in Vietnam, you're going to find their experiences just like in this country. The geography is quite different. So my time was spent up north. I never was in Saigon. I was never in the southern part. I never saw a lot of the fields of rice paddies that you typically see. Where we were was mainly hills, forest, that type of thing. So it was just totally different. And I talked to other vets who I know, and they have a total different perspective of what they saw in the part of the country that they were in. We saw mainly small villages and small towns. Probably the biggest city I was in was in Hue City. It was just a lot. It was just different than what you see. Most of the people we saw were very poor villagers. We saw a lot of Montagnards, which were the mountain people. We're very close to the Cambodian border, so we saw a lot of refugees that were back and forth. So I think everybody you're going to talk to is going to see a different side of it. It's just like you figure the state of California, how different it is, and that's similar to the size of Vietnam. So it was a different experience.
What was your job or your assignment?
I was there for 2.5 years, so my assignments varied at times. I was, when I first got there, I was a radio operator. I carried a radio. And all the little guys get all the big stuff. It's just the way it is. It's kind of, so I carried a radio. Then I became a squad leader. And at the end, I was a platoon sergeant. So had many different assignments. Some I was at fire support bases. Some we were out on patrols every day. So kind of varied.
There's a lot of people telling stories of they'd have one thing in particular they would carry to help them get through it. Some people have crosses and pictures. Was there anything that you always had with you?
I think we all had trinkets, I call them. I had a cross that was given to me by a Catholic priest. I'm not Catholic. I had something from my father that I carried. I think you have what's inside of you that gets you through. Knowing you got a strong family back home that supports you. Knowing that you got friends. Knowing you got people right with you who are going through the same thing you are. You kind of support each other. I don't think there's one thing that you can say that this did this for me, or because at various times there was a lot of things that got you through. Letters and packages from home were invaluable. My mother was very good at sending me things that helped me. And sometimes the cookies were awful stale, but they were still pretty good. And letters from my friends. Anything that brought home to you, because where you were was just so foreign and so distant and so different than anything you've ever experienced in your life. I think what got us through more than anything else was the idea that we were going home. And we've heard of short time calendars. We all had calendars that had how many, we'd cross off each day to know how many days that we were going to be there. Because our tours of duty were pretty well set. For the Marine Corps, they were 13-month tours. So you knew that when you went in, you had 395 days and you were going back to the world. So from day one, you started crossing them off. And there was a whole vocabulary set about being a short timer. And you get so short you can jump off a dime and hurt yourself. And so it was anything that brought home to you was valuable and helped you get through.
Was there ever a time with everything that was going on, was it ever hard to actually do your job? And like, was there a part of you inside that actually felt like there's a part of me that's tired or something like that?
Good question. When we talk about war, war's indiscriminate. Doesn't care. It doesn't, comes like a thief in the night. It challenges you. It'll take your body parts, it'll take your mind, it'll take your soul, it'll take everything you have. There's no end to it. It has no time. It doesn't care. So when you start talking about the bad parts of it, they don't ever go away. This Mother's Day, I was reminded of the young people who are over there right now in Iraq. And as most of you probably know, my daughter's Mrs. Curls. And we were just blessed with our first grandchild. And all that Mother's Day thing, all I could think about was my son-in-law. Because I told him before he left that when he comes back, he'll never again be the same. My father told me that, and it was true. It changes you forever. And also thought about on Mother's Day of a young soldier who was killed by a sniper and what his mother must be going through. So when you think about what it does to you, what it does against you, there's no way to comprehend all those feelings. So, I even forgot your question now. This is going to happen, so please excuse me.
Would you like me to repeat it?
Please.
Was there ever a day that you felt tired and felt weak that you didn't?
Every day. Because it robs every bit of strength from you. You forget to eat, you forget to sleep, you can't sleep, and there's no end to it. There's no holidays, there's no day off, there's no bell to tell you to go to the next class. It changes everything about you. You don't listen to things because they don't mean anything. And that's why those things from home we talked about are so important, because it brought back the reality to you of what was going on. I hope I answered that. Okay.
Were there ever any orders you received that you were really against but you had to carry out anyway?
Did you think this up? I think all people who serve in the military realize they take an oath. And when you take the oath, you accept certain things. And one of the things you accept is that everything that's going to happen you don't necessarily have to agree with. But you do it anyhow. And when I was a squad leader and responsible for the 12 other guys, I always felt I had one mission in life, and that was to get them back home. Everything else was immaterial. We were going to do our job, but the idea was to make sure everybody got back home. And it takes a while for you to realize you don't have control of that. You don't understand all of that. It's not something that you can really decide. Like I said, war's indiscriminate, and bad things happen to good people. I think there's times if you've gone out and paid a price for a piece of land or a chunk of real estate, and you just give it up, then you have to go back and do it again. I don't think you really want to do that. And you got to understand that the war in Vietnam was a political process as much as it was a war process. The people who were in Vietnam were just trying to get their job done and get back home. It's not like it is in Iraq right now, where the troops, the government, everyone was completely behind everything that was going on. That's not what happened in Vietnam. Vietnam was a long process. The history of Vietnam was not good. And if you ever get a chance to study the history of Vietnam, you should, because you're going to realize that the things that are going on were a result of a big political process in the whole world. Vietnam was another part of the Cold War. And at that time, it was about communism, the threat of communism throughout the world. You heard the domino theory. Vietnam was a result of the domino theory. It started way before the United States. In fact, our good friends, the French, if I may use that, were the first ones to get thrown out of Vietnam. And actually, if you look up the Vietnam War, what you find is the Vietnam War is the American term for the Vietnam War. The actual term for the Vietnam War was the Second Indochina War. The First Indochina War was with France, because actually it was French Indochina before it was Vietnam. And the communists in China, and if you look at the map, Vietnam borders China, were able to get a stronghold in the north, and that's what caused a split in the country. And a lot of people don't realize it was as much a religious conflict as it was a political conflict, because the people of French Indochina were Catholics, Christians, and to escape communism, they went to the south, and that's when the two formed. That's when the governments formed of the North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Were there orders that or things that we were asked to do? Yes, there were orders that you may not personally agree with, but you did them to the best of your ability, because that's the oath that you took.
Out of all your experiences, are there any that stick out more than others in the line?
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Do you remember where you were on September 11th, 2001? There are events like that that take part in every person's life, and those are the events that stick out. I can give you 4 dates that I remember in thinking about this before I came here. What events were important that I remember? I remember there are 4 dates that are very important to me. The first one was July the 20th, 1969. You probably don't know about that. It was Apollo 11. It's when man stepped foot on the moon. I remember sitting in a hole with water in the bottom of it, looking up at the moon, going, how in the world can we be putting a man on the moon, and here we are in this little country 12,000 miles away, sitting in water eating sea rations. How can this happen? How can we be so inquisitive as a society to want to go to the moon, and yet we can't solve our problems right here? So that's one date I remember. Another date I remember is August 18th, 1969. Probably doesn't mean much to you, but it was Woodstock. And Woodstock for us, viewing it from where we were, was part of the protest movement that was going on against the war. So to read about it and having us over there was created a lot of conflict internally about what was going on. One that's another date that I'm sure all of us in Ohio remember from the standpoint of the significance of it was May the 4th, 1970. It was Kent State. You've probably heard the songs about it. And it was significant to us again because it didn't provide us a lot of support who were over there about what was going on. We felt we'd been abandoned. We felt like we were doing something that we didn't have a purpose. What was the purpose of what we were doing? When you're 19 years old and everything that you value is put up in front of you, the morality, the goodness, the badness, all the things you've been taught all your life are suddenly brought into question. And at the same time, somebody might be trying to take you out. Those things bother you. And they create conflict inside of you. That's why when we came back from Vietnam, as a country, we lost 58,178 people that were killed in Vietnam. There was 5 times as many that were wounded or injured that came back. There's also a great number of people who came back physically, but I believe they never came back. They couldn't understand, they couldn't deal with, they didn't have the support systems, they didn't have strong family structures, they didn't have all the things that you need to support and be with you when you're facing the greatest crisis of your life. They didn't have that. And there's still some of those guys running around. And you read about them all the time. Former Vietnam vet goes crazy and does some wild things. That happens. And that's one of the casualties of war that we never get to think about or talk about. Another date, and I'm going to have a hard time with this, I'm going to tell you right now. April the 5th, 1969. EFC Richard Level, United States Marine Corps. Quarterback on my football team. Kid I grew up playing Little League Baseball with. Was killed in Vietnam. Until you have personal contact with that, it changes you. Just think about your best friend, your friends that you played sports with, that you've done all activities from the 6th grade up. Richard Level, his nickname was Pony. He was 6'2", about 190 pounds, and one of the most gifted athletes I've ever met in my life. He got a football scholarship to Southern Illinois University, and the second day of practice hurt his back, and he couldn't play football anymore. So he didn't handle that very well, and in the next year he didn't go back to school. Well, if you didn't go back to school back in 1968, you got drafted. And I can remember being at school. I went to Indiana University, and after semester was over, the young men were afraid to go to the mailbox. Because if you didn't pass, you got drafted. The status was called 2S. And if you weren't 2S, which means you got a student deferment, then you were 1A. And if you were 1A, you were gone. It's just the way it was. Well, Pony got drafted. and if you don't know this, all branches of service drafted except the Air Force. The Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps all drafted. Well, Pony got drafted. And 3 days, which would have been April the 2nd, Pony and I, through one of those random events of life, were together in Da Nang. I went down, we used to take turns going down for mail runs, because when you went down to the big city, you got to take a shower, you got a hot meal, and you got cold beer. So we took turns taking the mail down. So I was in Da Nang taking the mail down, picking up our mail, getting ready to bring it back, and Pony and I saw each other. And we spent about 5 hours together talking. And it was my first time I'd been with someone from my hometown. 3 days later, he's killed. I got to go home for the funeral. In the Marine Corps, we used, the slang term was body chasers. We got to go back and help the families and be with the families and do those kind of things. So I got to do that. And if you're ever in Washington, D.C., and you get the chance, go to panel 27W, row 019, and you'll see Richard Tyrone Level, PFC, United States Marine Corps. That was the event that caused the most pain for me, and still does to this day. And every November the 10th, which is the Marine Corps birthday, I get in my car and I drive to Jeffersonville, Indiana. And I go sit with Pony. I'm sorry.
Do you remember the first time when you got back and went to the wall in Washington, D.C., do you remember what was going through your mind?
Yeah. Similar to now. You know, the wall wasn't built right away. It took a long time to get done. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you need to go there. It's a very special place. And I got to go there with about 125 other thousand when it was dedicated. In 1995, me and 3 other guys who were in Vietnam together decided to get together and bring our families and go to Washington, D.C. And one of those, thank you, and one of those in this group that I was with thought it'd be a great idea if us 4 old codgers would run the Marine Corps Marathon while we were there. And so we trained for a year, and we all met, and on our 25th anniversary of coming back from Vietnam, we ran the Marine Corps Marathon in Washington, D.C. We weren't very fast, and one of us didn't train very well, not me, but the other, and it happened to be the guy who said we should do this. We have since not done that again. Not a smart thing. But yeah, when you go to the wall, it's a very special place. And I encourage you, if you ever go there, to please do that, because it's of all the monuments in Washington, D.C., it is by far the one that brings out the most emotion of any place I've ever been in my life. You can go there at midnight, you can go there at 5 o'clock in the morning, and there's always somebody there. And the National Archives, I think it is now, then accumulates all the things that are brought to the wall. And what they're doing now is trying to give some of it away because the storage facility is full. It's an incredible place.
There's all this talk about during the war, like a different terrain, something that the United States wasn't used to at the time. Do you think that through all the training that you went through, that there could ever be anything that would ever prepare you for what you experienced in the war?
Well, I think there's two levels of that. No one's trained for war. You don't know what's going to happen until you get there. But all the equipment, all of the training methods that you're utilizing, and each one of them is different. I can tell you about the problems the Marine Corps had. The Marine Corps is not a holding type organization. They were designed to go in, do their job, and come back out. Vietnam was the first time that the Marine Corps had ever been asked to go into a place of geography and stay there. So we weren't very good at that at the beginning. We had to learn how to do it. It was a new type of warfare. When I went through boot camp, we actually used training manuals that were mimeograph sheets because we had not been trained in that type of an environment before. The last war that the Marine Corps had been in was Korea, which was a cold weather war. So even our equipment, the packs, the type of carrying devices that we used, even the weaponry was new. So all those things are different, just like the guys who went to Kuwait and to Iraq had to train to be in sand. Their training was totally different. For example, you've seen the camouflage uniforms that the people wear. When they went to Iraq, those all had to be changed to what they call sand rather than forest. So the camouflage all had to change colors. All their equipment had to be painted all of that way. If you could see what goes behind taking 50,000 people and moving them so that they can go and exist and fight and have all the supplies they need, you can't imagine the supplies that have to be done to do that. Just like now, I don't know if you realize this, but they're running supplies up into Iraq out of Kuwait. The reason being, through convoys, the reason being, they don't want to build up large supplies of water, food, medicine, and all of that because they're afraid that the Iraqi people will come and try to steal it. And then they've got to do something to protect it. So what they're doing is running convoys up to try to keep the soldiers and the Marines and the Navy personnel and the Seabees and everybody else with supplies for only 5 days because they don't want to have, because of the situation. Each situation is different. Vietnam was a new one for us. Like I said, my drill instructors, I had the first drill instructors who had served in Vietnam. So they taught us all new things because of what we were going to be facing. We had never heard of booby traps before. We had never seen kids coming at you with weapons. We had never seen women with weapons before. And prior to that, everybody wore a uniform. We had never seen people out of uniform before. We didn't know what friendlies and hostiles were. It was pretty marked. Before that, there were trenches, there was roads, there were places that signified that. You go in a village during the daytime, they might be your enemy at nighttime. So it was totally different. And I don't know if you ever get prepared for that. You learn the rules. Let me say this. Of all the rules that you've got to learn you've got to learn to forget everything you were taught up until then. And that's tough. If you're taught right and wrong, when you go to war, there's no right and wrong. Morality gets challenged. What's right and what's wrong. Talk about making decisions about orders and stuff. It becomes a big conflict. It's okay for people who are 50 years old with lots of experience to make those decisions. It's very difficult for 17, 18, and 19-year-old people to do that. I was watching a basketball, the NCAA tournament the other day. One of the announcers was bragging about how fitting it was that this one point guard on Syracuse, who was 19 years old, was able to go out and they made the statement. Just think, this young man was in high school last year. Look what he's been able to accomplish. Well, just think about this. There's 18 and 19-year-olds who were in high school last year over in Iraq right now who are playing for real. They don't say they're suiting up to go to war. They're going to war. It's a big difference. And I want you to, as young people, to understand that this may happen in the future again. Remember I talked about the Cold War? Well, one of the nice things about the Cold War, if you can say that, there were other superpowers other than us. We may be destined to be the policemen of the world. There may be more Iraqs. There may be more hostilities coming. There's a lot of young people, not much older than you, who are out there doing that right now. The young man in Hamilton was 19 years old. He was a senior last year in high school. That's pretty ominous when you think about it.
You said, we talked about earlier about how the war had changed you. How do you think it changed you personally?
Whew. I think we're all a product of our past. My parents and my family were products of the Depression and World War II. So they taught me with values that they had coming up. I think all of our experiences that we have and things that happen to us cause us to change as we go through different priorities in our life. My father told me the day that I left for Vietnam that when I returned that I would never again look at things the way I used to, that my relationship with him would be changed forever, and that I would put more value on human life than I ever have in my past. I would get to see poor people for the first time, and believe you me, we are not poor in this country. I would get to see misery for the first time. Coming from a little town in Indiana, Jeffersonville, Indiana, to going over there was a cultural shock for me. I never understood what value things really have when it comes to life, when it comes to future, when it comes to family. And I think unlike most people who were in that situation, I made a little promise to myself. I never want my children to have to go through that. I don't want anyone to ever have to go through that. So, does it change you? Yes. If we had 10 people up here, they'd give you 10 different answers. Because it's a personal experience. It's not something that you can just say, everybody turns out this way and that's the way things happen. It's a life-changing experience. And you don't ever want to go back. But I will tell you this, I've talked to I don't know how many people who were in Vietnam when Iraq broke out, when it was apparent that we were going to go Iraq. I haven't talked to anyone that I know who would not have taken the place of those people that are there now so that they wouldn't have to go through that. If you know anybody who's over there, if you know anybody's family who's over there, realize they're going to be changed forever. And I'm not saying it's all good or it's all bad. They're just going to be changed forever. We call it the hole in your soul. And that's what happens. It takes away your youth. takes away your future, and it changes you forever.
Over in the war, like, people who enlisted, you noticed that they typically, there's a certain experience level, you know, in their tactics and stuff. Could you see a difference could you tell by looking at a person if that person was drafted or was he enlisted?
Nope. Couldn't tell. The reason you couldn't tell, when you got in country, everything was, again, your sole goal was to get home. Everybody's was. And it didn't matter if you were drafted or if you enlisted. You know what we call enlistees? Crusaders. So it didn't matter. They were there, you were there, everyone was equal. And if you don't know, there was a time when race problems were really bad. Those came to Vietnam. There were times when drug problems were a problem here. Those came to Vietnam. Just because we were there did not make us immune from what was going on back here in the States. So everybody dealt with the same cultural problems and societal problems the same way. And whether you were drafted or whether you were an enlistee didn't matter.
You said when you got there, your first thing you were thinking about was getting home. When you did get home, was it different than you expected, or did you have any problems with some protesters?
Yes and yes. I got home at 11 o'clock in the evening. My parents didn't know I was coming home. It was May 15th, 1970. And I landed in Louisville, Kentucky at the airport, and it was still rather cool. Of course, we'd come from Vietnam, so I remember I was very cold because I had on short sleeve shirt and uniform. And so I didn't want to call my mom and dad. I wanted to surprise them. So I got in a cab, and when we got about half a mile from my home, I got out of the cab and I walked home. I remember walking down my neighborhood, my street, and doing all those kind of things. And knocked on the door, and my dad came to the door, and we talked for a few minutes, and then my mother took me downstairs to where my room was. And she had a Christmas tree there. And she had kept the Christmas tree for me. And the first night I didn't sleep. And the second night, well, first of all, when we got back to the States, we landed in Los Angeles, and that's where I caught my flight out of. And there was like 15 of us, and we got there, and we were catching what was the red eye because of the time difference back to the East Coast. So we all went in this restaurant to eat, and we ordered way too much food. Our eating habits had changed, but we all wanted cold milk, eggs, you know, the things you couldn't have for so long. And we were sitting there, like I said, there was about 6 of us around this table. We were over in a corner, and there was some young people there who were, quote, of the hippie generation, I guess, the way they were dressed. And they started talking very loudly about the war and what was going on and what happened, and it became very apparent we were the target of their conversations. And it was the first time I'd ever physically heard things like that. Were they protesters? I don't know. Were they didn't do anything or just go on?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if they were protesters or not. I sure didn't like the way they were talking about us. we were all shocked. We'd heard about these things. Like I said, Kent State had just happened. It was still in the news. We knew about things like Woodstock, and we knew about the music, and we knew about the demonstrations. We knew about the stuff that was going on campuses. We knew about all that. So I guess we learned to ignore it. And so demonstrators, protesters, whatever. I will tell you this. In my high school class, a very good friend of mine chose to go to Canada rather than be drafted. He was a very accomplished musician, and he is done quite well for himself. He lives in Toronto. At our last class reunion, I won't tell you how many years ago, it was 35. At our last class 35th reunion, Bill was there. And there was, I think, 27 guys in my class. I graduated in a class of 413. There was 27 guys who went to Vietnam. We were extremely fortunate. We only lost. We had more people in the class commit suicide than we lost in Vietnam. We had more people die in car wrecks than we lost in Vietnam. But there was enough of us there that when Bill came to the meeting, it was uncomfortable. This is 35 years ago. For some of the guys there, they couldn't even talk to him because he chose to go to Canada. So again, I go back. All this stuff is very personal. Sometimes you got to draw your own lines in the sand. You got to decide what's important for you, what's important for other people, what's important for them. Somebody asked me the other day, well, don't you feel bad watching TV and seeing all these guys getting off these ships and getting these return home welcome and heroes and all that stuff? No, they deserve it. The time we were there was different. The country was different. It was just a different set of circumstances. Would I have liked for it to have been different? Sure. But it wasn't. So to go back, it's bad enough to have been through it. You shouldn't have to go back and let it bother you for the rest of your life. Okay?
Can you describe like the combat that you faced while in Vietnam?
No.
Can you describe?
I'm sorry, I can't answer.
If you were going to give somebody who's enlisting into the services right now, potentially going to war, what would you tell them?
I'll tell them what I told my son-in-law. Okay? We talked the night before he left. I'll tell him what my father told me. I'll share some of it with you, but not all of it. I think I said earlier, he told me I was going to be different when I came back. I was going to see things that would change me forever. I was going to see things that I shouldn't see. I was going to be different because my experiences were going to be different. The hardest thing for me was to understand that there are no rules. Just because you do everything right doesn't mean you live. Just because the guy next to you did everything right doesn't mean that he lives, he dies, and you live. There's no rhyme or reason for any of that. It's indiscriminate. It happens. That's the hardest thing to accept. Good people don't go home. Good people come home with body parts missing. And good people come home with their souls gone. That's how bad it is. Imagine the worst pain you've ever felt in your life and think that's the norm. And that's what happens to you. No sleep, no food, no time becomes the norm. And you just kind of go through the motions. The 1,000-yard stare, that's what you got. It just happens. So all those things, they just take away from you. They just take things from you and you never get them back. You can tell people that. And I'm sure my son-in-law, when he comes home, will have seen things like that. But I will tell you this, my father and I never spoke of these things ever again. He told me before I went, and that was it. And I'm sure when my son-in-law comes home, him and I will never speak of these things because they're yours. And only you should have to deal with them. You shouldn't ask other people to take on what you've taken on. It's the burden you carry. That's the way it is.